So, in contrast to Taoism, we have its contemporary, which is Confucianism, founded by the philosopher, political advisor, sage Confucius uh, in the 6th century BCE, right? In China, uh, this is uh, this is a very different sort of philosophy from any of the ones that we've talked about so far. All the philosophical worldviews we've discussed so far have been primarily ones that are concerned with metaphysics in some way. Ethics may have been a part of Zoroastrianism, but it's an ethics that comes out of a metaphysical framework. And we might have talked about the nature of virtue for Taoism, but it's a question of virtue as it pertains to aligning ourselves with that metaphysical framework, right? So in each case, the metaphysics takes prominence. Confucianism, by contrast, is a social, political, and ethical philosophy, moral philosophy first and foremost. What's secondary to it would be epistemology and the metaphysics, right? So it's not the structure and order of reality that's of importance. It's the moral concerns that are most important in Confucianism, right? But even for these questions and deliberations on morality that Confucianism delves into, and which we'll cover in greater detail in uh, later on, right? So even for these, what's important is some metaphysical assumptions. Chiefly, there is a metaphysical assumption about the nature of the self that's at the center of Confucianism, right? And also at the center of Taoism too, and in the Vedic philosophies and Buddhism. In fact, it wouldn't be wholly inaccurate to say that this is a very broadly metaphysical assumption that divides quote unquote Western from Eastern philosophies, right? And this is the assumption about the nature of the self, right? How the self is thought of. So in the Western tradition, the tradition that the pre-Socratics are working in, the self is thought of as kind of a self-contained unit, if you'll pardon the pun, right? It's a whole, right? And it's a solid whole. We have the notion of the soul that kind of goes along with this. We also see this in like biblical thought with the Judaic and Christian traditions, and thus the Islamic one. There's a soul that's individual. It's relegated to just the one person, and nothing and no one can touch it, right? So there's an emphasis on autonomy and individualism as a result, right? Um, if you picture it, you can think of the self as like a circle, right? Um, with there's a solid border and it's fully enclosed, right? So how do we think about the interaction between selves then? Well, it's the interaction between two wholes, right? That are fully self-defined, right? So it's more like drawing a line between them, right? If you've all seen the meme um, from uh, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where Charlie is like doing the whole conspiracy theory board, right? The connection board, right? So it's like drawing a thread between points, right? It's drawing a thread between the circles. And this is rather important because it forces us to, and we see it reflected in our ethical thinking in the West, for the most part. It forces the front and center the individual, right? And individual concerns. And so we think about morality from the point of view, we have a tendency to think about morality from the point of view as if it's to be universal, it has to apply to everyone equally, right? Now, That's because in this model of the self, we can be subtracted from the world, and the world can be subtracted from us. And we can think about things rationally with regards to each without considering the connection between the two, unless it calls for it. In contrast, the Eastern view of the self, this view of the self at the center of Confucianism, is more like the self as a Venn diagram, right? There's points of overlap, and there's no, can't really do this well, right? So take those two same circles, right, and have them overlap, right? There's going to be a point where they intersect with each other, right? So a Venn diagram, if you may or may not have done this in high school, but the point of a Venn diagram is to see what features overlap between two separate things, right? So you have thing A over here that has features A, B, C, D, E, and you have thing B over here that has features D, E, G, no, F, G, H, right? What features do they share? Features D and E. D and E go in the middle at the point of overlap. Well, if you think about people in that way, then you already think about them as standing importantly in relation to each other, and equally of importance, being partially defined by each other, right? So in the case of the Western view of the self, where we're individual and connected by a line, right? So what connects you to me is that line of, professor to student relationship, and that's it, right? And that can be severed, right? Um, once the semester ends. In this view, uh, that relationship is a part of who we are, or at the very least, a part of our dynamics together, right? It's a part of how we think of ourselves and how we think of ourselves in relations to each other, right? And this makes more sense and has more impact when you think about things like friends, right? Consider how we talk about the loss of, a friend, right? We talk about losing a piece of ourselves, right? Like, okay, we still sort of define ourselves by that point of overlap that's no longer there. Uh, we also see metaphors, for the more individualistic model of the Western view of the self when we think about things like cutting people off, right? Breaking it off, right? Cutting ties, right? These are all lines that kind of encapsulate that form of thinking. Um, but this is an important aspect, right? Confucianism, like I said, we'll get into this a little bit later, but Confucianism is by definition, um, not necessarily definition, well, yeah, it is by its origins a moral and political philosophy, more than it is a metaphysics, right? Metaphysics is tertiary, honestly, um, other than like this view of the self, which is central to it.